Dean Sylvester, it's great to be your guest. I'm touched by your willingness to have me. I'm moved by Seth's kind words, and I realize that we're all about raising money. So I have to tell you my favorite story that it's not in my notes, but it just reminded me. I've had the big blessing of hearing both a prophet and a saint. The prophet was Solzhenitsyn, that Seth just referenced, and I wasn't going to talk about that, but I actually sat in the rain when he delivered his speech in Russian and was translated in English behind the editor of the Harvard Crimson who was drinking a Heineken and smoking a J. And so I sat next to Alan Keyes for the entire address, which went 90 minutes in the rain. It was the most depressing hour and a half of my life. But he was a prophet, but he was wrong. He predicted that the West would decline and would lose to the Soviet Union, and of course, subsequent to that, arose a force in the West by the name of Reagan, and the rest is literally history, although we may have to do it again. But I also got to hear a saint, and this goes to raising money. In 1985, I went to work in the White House, and because I shared an office with a very smart young lawyer by the name of Roberts, who's now the Chief Justice of the United States, I had nothing to do, really, nothing to do. Because if you're Fred Fielding and you're the White House counsel and you have a problem and you come into an office and there's Hugh Hewitt and there's John Roberts, you give the problem to John Roberts. So I really had nothing to do except write letters protecting the seal of the United States against limousine services. And that was quickly dispatched with. So I could go to any single participating event I wanted to because I had the important badge. And Mother Teresa came to the White House to receive the American Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor. And I'm Roman Catholic. And so I was going to be in, if not the first row, the second row. And I got there and in time. And out of the Oval comes the Gipper, the grand old man, smiling and beaming and larger than life. And right behind him comes the smallest woman I have ever seen in my life. She is not 5 feet in her flat white shoes with her little blue veil. And the president gave a typical Peter Robinson, Josh Gilder, Peggy Noonan written speech of glowing praise for this human saint who later is in fact now a saint, Saint Mother Teresa. And at the end of it, he leans over and he puts the Medal of Freedom over her very tiny shoulders and he says, "Would you like to say anything, Mother Teresa?" And she said yes. And he took the microphone, he leaned it way down, and she said, "Mr. President, I need more money." And I took from that moment an endless willingness to ask people for money, because if a saint can do it and the cause is right and the cause is just, then you never ought to be shy about asking for that which you need. Absolutely never be shy. So when Dean Sylvester comes up, I appreciate your supporting the law school, because I appreciate law schools. Chapman tries this, to bring in diverse speakers from across the ideological spectrum. That is not the rule, that is the exception. And so you have a law school that is dedicated to that, and it's got to be vibrant and it's got to be civil, and I spent this afternoon with the Federalist Society trying to model that. I've done it my entire career with Justice Breyer and Secretary Clinton, and this past week Senators Kuhn and King. I like talking to people with whom I don't agree so that we can move forward, but I am intimidated to follow John Bolton. And because I wrote a column for the Washington Post on Friday about why I think the appointment of Ambassador Bolton as the new National Security Advisor is so providential, so timely, and that in the combination with Secretary Mattis, Secretary Pompeo, and DNI, Coates, and others in the administration, we have a foreign policy team the equal of the late Reagan years, which, if you will recall, consisted of Secretary Shultz, maybe the greatest living American, who stormed the beaches at Peleliu, and at 97 is still doing fine at the Hoover Institution, and has been basically every appointed job in the United States, and was a terrific Secretary of State. We had at CIA at that time, a combination of leaders because they had turned over, but we had Frank Carlucci at the Department of Defense. We had a national security advisor by the name of Colin Powell. We had a chief of staff by the name of Howard Baker, and we had a secretary of the Treasury by the name of James Baker. And they were the brain trust. President Reagan was often mocked for not being a great intellect, but in fact what he was a great judge of talent. And he brought talent to the White House in such abundance that it really did turn the course of history. But I was thinking about that in light of the appointment of Mr. Bolton, because I was on Meet the Press yesterday, and so I was in the green room, and green rooms in Washington, D.C., as Seth will tell you, are all alike. They're the most gossipy places in the world. Absolutely dishing on everybody. It's all off the record. People are just trashing everybody left and right. No one has thrown Washington, D.C. more into panic than John Bolton since Ronald Reagan, because a man who knows his own mind and has convictions scares the living daylights out of the Beltway. And so they are running for the hills. John Bolton is not a scary man, as you know. How many of you were here last year? Then you know he's charming, erudite, completely learned, the smartest guy in the room. I like to say I've met a few geniuses. John Roberts is one. Mitt Romney is another. Richard Nixon is a third. I think that John Bolton is as well. And if you read his memoir, Surrender is Not an Option, it is a concise, comprehensive time of his service as Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Division, Undersecretary of State for International Security, the Director of AID, Covington and Burling partner like Senator Kyle, just extraordinary, culminating in the UN, but in fact his whole life has been preparing for this moment. So you had him here a year ago, and so what a prophet to have done that. Whatever he said, I hope you have it on tape, because now it's a matter of history. Because a year ago, he didn't know he was going to be stepping into the job that we all thought Mike Flynn would hold for 4 years a year ago. And there is a temptation to say, because we are on our third national security advisor in 14 months, that there isn't a decision-making process, which I promised to talk about tonight in my remarks. But that's not the case. In fact, almost every first year of every presidency is marked by rapid turnover in a number of different places and by catastrophic errors in judgment. Almost every single first year of a presidency. John F. Kennedy's was the Vienna Summit, and you can just go through them. I don't have to remind you of them, but it's a very hard job. It's the hardest job there is. And probably the most prepared person ever to enter into it was George H.W. Bush, because George H.W. Bush had been around for 8 years with Ronald Reagan participating in the decision process. He had the smoothest, but it also coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it helps to be standing around at the right time when the empire falls. You can't go wrong, but then you can contrast that with George W. Bush in his first year, when the worst attack on American soil, not named Pearl Harbor, had occurred. So it's a rough patch for anyone to learn how to do the hardest job in the world. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, in keeping with free markets and free ideas and the law school's commitment, is what I have discerned about the decision-making process by President Trump. And you should know going in that he and I have an unusual relationship. He doesn't like me, and I have a number of Trump tattoos because I was a participant in the debates, and that's okay. I try and maintain an objectivity about whoever's in the office and try and call balls and strikes. That's what I think is the job of the media to do. And this talk coincided with my being asked by the Post to write a review of a new book that will come out in 2 weeks called The Trump White House by Ron Kessler. He's written 21 books, former Washington Post reporter. And it's a reflection, a very accurate reflection, of the events of the first year of the Trump White House. And it's also based on both on and off the record interviews with at least the following: Reince Priebus, who's a very good friend, Sean Spicer, the same, Kellyanne Conway, H.R. McMaster, Mike Pompeo, Secretaries Carson and Azar, and Attorney General Sessions, OMB Director Mulvaney, Speaker Ryan, Leader McConnell, the RNC Chair Rona Romney McDowell, and many other people Mike Pence. I have not spoken with the president since he became president. Like I said, he's still mad at me for the debates. They were rocky. They were interesting. And it's all on the record, what I'm about to tell you, but it is supplemented by off-the-record conversations, too voluminous to recount, including those in the green room and on the set yesterday, where certain patterns emerge that leads me to the overarching conclusion. The Trump decision-making process is not chaos. It is not incoherent. It is simply not ordinary. It is extraordinary. It is different from anything we've seen before. And that is very unnerving to very many people. President Trump disintermediated many people of influence from their influence when he arrived in Washington, D.C., and that has caused a great deal of stress among elites. Disintermediation is a term that I came to know in a off-the-record session which I've received permission from President Bush to tell you about. But on the two occasions, he would invite a half-dozen talk show hosts back to the White House to sit down and chat with him. Both of those I went with Bill Bennett to. The first one I'll come back to in a moment and tell you about disintermediation, but I thought I would tell you this one anecdote about George W. Bush. The second one was on the last Wednesday of his presidency, when he called in 6 talk show hosts for one purpose, to ask them to give the new guy a chance. That was the essential George W. Bush, to lay off of the new guy because the job was so incredibly difficult. And he walked us through the events of 2008 in that room, where every Sunday afternoon, like clockwork, a crisis that threatened the very foundation of American capitalism would arrive. And he would be greeted by the Secretary of the Treasury and Ben Bernanke, and they would say, Mr. President, you have to do something you've pledged your whole life not to do because we have to save the American economy. And every week he would do it. And he related this to the 6 talk show hosts, and he said, and so President Obama will be facing a job that is way too big for anyone to do, but which we routinely ask people to learn how to do, so please lay off of him. Most of us did. Bill and I did, Seth and I did, for a long period of time. We tried to encourage him at the beginning. Obamacare was a turning point in the relationship with the presidency, but always with the respect that I believe the presidency is owed. And so when I would refer to President Obama on the air, it was always about President Obama. And when nutters would call up with, he was born in Kenya, I would call them nutters. And that level of respect is necessary. I sense it is not there for President Trump. Right? I believe that there is no margin of grace whatsoever from the first day, and I would argue that with my friends on the left side, President Trump received far less grace in his first year than President Obama did from our side in their first year. And I know that to be true because I've been a part of this at MSNBC, NBC, The Washington Post, and here. But if you step back, what really happened goes back to that first meeting with George W. Bush with Bill Bennett. And Bennett, of course, wants a tough question asked so he can do the bank shot. He wants to get the rebound and come in for the bank. So he sets me up in the lobby. Says, you're going to ask him about how many terrorists we've killed? I said, Bill, what? He said, no, not really. You're going to ask him. Because they wouldn't, if you recall, release the numbers that we were killing in the war. It was a decision by the Pentagon that the president acceded to, in which he eventually changed because of this series of questions. Bill sent me in I was the blocking back. And I said, okay, I'll just do what you do. You were the Secretary of Education. I was a briefcase carrier. I'll do it. So I said, Mr. President, why aren't we tougher on the Iranians? And why in the world aren't we releasing the number of terrorists that we've killed in Iraq? He did answer them in reverse order, which brings me to the word disintermediate. He said, well, the Iranians, we're disintermediating their money. And then he stopped and he said, pretty big word for me, isn't it, disintermediate? So I've always been struck, I hear that W voice saying disintermediate, huh? And I got to learn what that term meant. It was before Uber arose and disintermediated cabs everywhere. It was before Airbnb arose and disintermediated hotels everywhere. But disintermediation was not a term in wide use in 2007 when we had this conversation. And in fact, the ire that Trump evokes, the president evokes, is because he genuinely has disintermediated from influence scores, if not hundreds, of people who previously had a very rare commodity, which is they could command the respect of a room into which they entered and pretend to have influence over the White House. I say pretend because more often than not, people who say they have influence over the White House, it was my experience in the Reagan White House, pretended to, and those that had it very rarely spoke of it because that's how they marshaled it and kept it close. President Trump has generated a brand new category of political activist, the never-Trumper. And I don't know, some of you might be never-Trumpers, but I'm studying it as a phenomenon. There's never been an insurgent movement within the dominant party dedicated every day to tearing down their party's leadership. It's never happened before. And yet it is vibrant and alive and personified in some friends of mine like Max Boot and Bill Crystal and many other people that I'm not friends with, like Jen Rubin and other people, but every single day. Nicole Wallace on my network or Steve Schmidt on my network. Every single day, every story is negative about Trump. And that's because, not them specifically, but the entire structure of Washington has been turned upside down as to how one influences decision making. To understand how radical the change is, you have to go back to what is the departure from. It's from the Haldeman system. H.R. Bob Haldeman, whom I had the pleasure of meeting once after he got out of jail, and I had set up being the smart young advanced man I was for Richard Nixon, lunch with him at the Jailhouse restaurant at Ray Price, which was the old jail in San Clemente, not realizing what I had done. And when we walked in, Haldeman looked at me with a glare and said, "Is this a joke?" And then he broke into a big smile, because it was kind of a stupid young advanced man's joke to do. And we had a great lunch, but Bob Haldeman established a system where Richard Nixon would receive only the end product of the staff work, and only after every member of the staff had seen it and had checked off that they had seen it and either marked approved or disapproved. So that everything RN saw in the White House that was policy-driven from the Ehrlichman shop or political-driven from the Colson shop, whatever, had been shopped around everywhere and had got the chop on it. It's the only way that he would act on a piece of paper. The Haldeman system was subsequently adopted. It was unique. Johnson had many, many avenues into the Oval Office. And John F. Kennedy, as was pointed out yesterday on Meet the Press, sometimes didn't have anyone operating in that position as chief of staff. He simply had an open door access to anyone who had credential. Bobby would show up and bring over the AG thing. He didn't really have a staff secretary. It was really much more informal in the early 60s. Ike ran a chief of staff situation, but it wasn't to vet everything through the policy, a very different sort of approach. And his last chief of staff got in trouble for graft, and he really rebelled against the system. Haldeman put it in place. And from Haldeman until Reince, and Reince will be the first person to tell you, I quote him, "I wasn't chief of staff, I was chief of stuff." And you can substitute different words for that if you want. But he was just basically the wagon master of a caravan of people who have access to the White House. Because President Trump operates completely differently, and he has never heard of a routing slip or a review system before. He does involve, and this is again reporting, I'm not making this up, he relishes what we call early Clinton approach to the presidency. The early Clinton approach to the presidency was to hold all night long conversations in the Roosevelt room about whatever interested Bill Clinton. And so he would go all night long with Bob Reich and just a bunch of intellectuals talking about ideas who had power to implement them. Not much got done, if you recall, 93 to 94, the first 2 years of the Clinton White House, except Clinton Care, which failed miserably because it was the product of a bunch of intellectuals sitting around under Ira Magaziner trying to come up with the most complicated flowchart in the history of man. And it was put up on the Senate, and it killed it the moment that it was unveiled. President Obama operated very much on the same staff system where a bunch of intellectuals got around and designed Obamacare and designed the Joint Comprehensive Program of Cooperation with Iran, which, as President Trump has correctly pointed out, is the single worst diplomatic deal the United States has ever entered into. Disagree with me if you want or not, but it's going to be dead soon, so it doesn't matter. It's going to be dead within 2 months after John Bolton and Mike Pompeo arrived there. So how does he instead operate? President Trump operates like every developer I have ever worked for operates. I worked for 30 years as a land use lawyer. I still nominally practice a little bit of land use when I have an old client with a California gnatcatcher, a Delhi Sands flower-loving fly, fringe-toed lizard, you name it, I've litigated it. The arroyo toad, the condor, I do it, you get it, and I never thought my 3 years at Michigan would be devoted to picking up rat scat in the middle of Riverside County, but that's what I was doing. The 30 years of dealing with developers led me to understand that there's a personality type that goes into development. It's a personality type that insists upon winning. And that winning is personified in the thing called a permit. A permit is actually what this building was built on the authority of. And every permit is the end result of a process. We have some other land use lawyers here, and they know what I'm talking about. A land use permit is the end of a process that is local, state, and federal, often multi-tiered with many agencies. And so a developer becomes whomever he or she needs to be in whatever room they are in for the purpose of obtaining whatever it is that they need that moment. They do not often break the law, but I've had to remind a few of them of the need not to do so. And it is a constant challenge when the only desire is to get to the permit to slow them down on the argument that patience is better than speed, because of course in the land development business, every day costs you money. Every day you've borrowed against the land, so every day that you delay is a day that you are losing money and you're not winning. So President Trump brings to that decision-making process, number one, a desire for the permit and a need to be whatever he needs to be at the time that it's called upon, an enormous flexibility, which he admitted to during the debates, by the way. None of this is a surprise. All of this was telegraphed from day one. His second and overriding skill set is of a producer. Now, Seth was a producer for a while, and now he's a talent. And producers are the people who actually make the show go. And I have a joke running on my show for 18 years now that if only I had a producer, I have the best producer in radio. He's so good that I can pretend he's not there. But producers have in mind show. And show is you've got to gain and hold an audience for at least 23 minutes, which is the average time spent listening to a radio talk show in the morning drive, in order to make it a viable audience of 1 million to 2 million to 4 million, whatever it might be on any given show, depending on the number of stations that you're on. You've got to drive a narrative. You've got to give them hooks, and there are different tricks that we practice in our trade: promote forward, embed ads, mainline guests, use audio bits, they're called actuals, lots of different things. President Trump is a producer and has been a producer from the moment The Apprentice went on the air. And I like to tell people that when he dominated the debates, we shouldn't have been surprised in the way that we were, because the man who won them had a strategy from the beginning to take down the next closest rival in order. And I did 4 of the 12 debates. I participated in 4 of the 12 debates, and it was a thing of art to behold, because laser-like, he focused only on the person he had to take out next. And if he was diverted, he would throw off an aspersion or an aside. But first it was low-energy jab, and then it just moved down the cycle of people that he needed to take out because he produced shows. When Reince Priebus set up 12 debates in 2015 to occur in 2016, he didn't know it, but he gave the nomination to Donald Trump because he set up 12 shows, and the 12 shows that we had never had before. And the experienced performer in those shows won every one of them except the one he didn't go to. And he made a mistake when he didn't go to the one debate that he didn't win is the one that he didn't go to. So add to this developer's drive for results, a producer's desire for entertainment and ratings, and you get the presidential decision-making process. Now, it's very different from a staff process. One story to tell you about a staff process. The remarkable Peggy Noonan, one of the most gifted speechwriters ever, once stormed into Fred Fielding's office, the counsel to the president, to complain about why this young lawyer had critiqued her speech. The young lawyer was the now Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, and it embarrasses Peggy a great deal that she was screaming at Fred about John Roberts criticizing her writing. He's, of course, a tremendous writer. But that was what staffing would do. It would slow everything down so that if Peggy wrote a speech for the Gipper, it went through the counsel's office first, it went to the National Security Council after that, went to the Council on Economic Advisors, and everyone would have their input. So bad was the staff process that Peter Robinson wrote, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," 4 times. And 4 times it was taken out by the State Department or the National Security Council until Peter sat down with Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office and told him his woe. And the president said, "Well, it's in then." And he wrote "leave" on the draft so that Mr. Gorbachev to tear down this wall almost was a casualty of the staff process, which illustrates the downside of the staff process. It crushes creativity and initiative. It slows everything down so you don't make mistakes but you also don't accomplish a great deal, at least until you're rolling, until your second or third year, and you know what you're trying to get done, or until a crisis arises, as happened on 9/11, and the entire government mobilizes around it. So what President Trump is doing is simply combining his skill sets into a decision process that we have never seen before, one of which is so unnerving to people who like to comment on the process, who believe in process, as many of us believe in process. The dean is probably the biggest believer in process in the room, because process is the only way you can fend off a faculty with demands. It's the only way that you can prevent students from overrunning the house. You've got to have a process, and you've got to say, no, that doesn't go that way. We're going to have a faculty meeting, and you've got to get it on the agenda, and then the agenda's got to be noticed 3 times, and we'll make sure we run out of time at the first meeting so we can put it over to the second meeting. I've been to more faculty meetings since 1996. Honest to God, it's worse than waterboarding. It's an enhanced means of interrogation. So I told him in the way in I would never, ever have his job. So what does he do? He arrives at the conclusion he wants to reach. We're going to get out of the Paris Accord. He does it instinctually. Then he sets his conclusion in front of warring factions and has them argue it out quite vigorously and at great length, and often over a period of weeks. I use the Paris Accord because I know the most about it, and it's been talked about the most on the record. And Rex Tillerson will weigh in to stay in Paris, and Scott Pruitt will weigh in to get out of Paris. And Jared Kushner, I don't know where Jared was on that one, or Ivanka, I can't remember, but I know that Mattis also wanted to stay in, but Mnuchin wanted out. And it was a free-for-all. And the president sat there and listened to the whole thing. That's, by the way, he's an audible learner. He's not a reading learner. I'm a reading learner. Some people are audible learners. Some people are got to have the PowerPoint, right? I hate the PowerPoint. He has done this again and again and again, only to test the intuitive decision at which he's already arrived. He intuitively knew the Iran deal is terrible, and he has been bursting at the seams to get out of it and insisting on exiting it. He wanted to move the Jerusalem embassy, wanted to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. No one wanted him to do that in the United States Department of State. Nobody wanted him to do that. In fact, in the Republican Party, we had long debates about whether or not that would hinder the peace process, whether it would set off riots, whether it would cause massive disruption in our newly emerging alliance of the Saudis, the Israelis, the Gulf states, the Sunni tribes. He did it anyway, after he had this long process, because that's where he intuitively arrived at. What this does is actually evolve a decision-making process that is most like, in my experience, the making of a movie. And if you have any experience in the making of a movie or a television series, you will know that there is a rough cut that is extraordinarily longer than the final product. It's not like radio. We have to fill 180 minutes, and we know exactly what. A rough cut is much longer. You do many scenes that are left on the cutting floor. And the biggest epics are the ones that came out in the 60s, the Ben-Hurs and the El Cids, et cetera. Those rough cuts were 5 and 6 hours long, and they got them down to 3 hours. Heaven's Gate, the greatest disaster in modern American filmmaking, had a rough cut of like 6 hours. So you start with a rough cut and you move it down. And along the way, director's notes are taken. And director's notes watch the rough cut, and he writes to himself, or she writes to herself, comments on what must be reshot, the lighting, the sound, the remixing. If you understand the president's Twitter feed as the director's notes on the rough cut of a movie that is in production, you have what is going on right now. We've never had so transparent a presidency. So for those who value transparency, we thought we did. Turns out we don't. I don't. It causes enormous anxiety to know that the president changes his mind a lot, often within an hour, usually in morning drive. And so I'm dealing with this Twitter feed every morning. By the way, it's made show prep irrelevant. And what I used to prepare hours to do, I just show up and he'll provide some material by the hour number 2, and that's almost true every day. And they have stopped running the show prep on Meet the Press until Thursday. There is no point in doing show prep rundown until Thursday, and even then it's very risky. And on Saturday we have a call, and often the Thursday call is different from the Saturday call, and often the Sunday morning show is different from the Saturday call. That is transparency, and it is immediacy, and it's production value. Now, I have an electric fence theory of President Trump, which I will test out on you and you can take home. Electric fences teach first-time users in a painful way. They proceed until they hit the fence, they are shocked, and they retreat from it. And they don't do it again, or if most, they do it twice. On many occasions in the campaign and the presidency, we have seen the president run into the electric fence. Judge Curiel, right, that was the electric fence moment. That's when I almost got off the Trump plane completely, because you don't attack sitting federal judges on the basis of ethnicity, though he did not understand himself to be doing that. A second was the family of the fallen soldier. I'm forgetting her name right now, and I didn't write it down. Yes, the Khans. When the attack on the Khans happened, it took him a while to figure out that was unacceptable. There are policy decisions which have occurred since this as well, which include, for example, the tariff decision of 3 weeks ago, which was a terrible decision, right? A terrible decision. And in fact, the president's metrics include he loves the market rising. So when the market fell dramatically on Friday, he let it be known that he doesn't really mean it, and it went up 620 points today. Very hard, as I said earlier in a meeting, to be a day trader during the Trump presidency. But it is a process. It's just not what we're used to. And it especially upsets people who used to be called in to stroke their chins and scratch their heads and produce position papers, because he doesn't read them. He just doesn't care what the position paper says. You've got to argue it in front. Now, if any of you have worked with a developer and you're on the clock and they want their permit, they don't care that you have many good excuses. They simply dismiss it as being something that you should have handled. And lawyers will grip and gripe about their clients forever for this simple reason: they don't understand the law, and they don't care to. That's what you're being paid to do, is to understand the law and obtain the permit. I've lined up the financing, I have the vision, I'm building the building, I'm doing the development. That is Donald Trump. And all he has done now in the first year is get the largest tax cut in history in gross dollars. Okay, it matters quite a lot in terms of GDP. We're going to achieve between 3% and 4% GDP growth. Rolled back the regulatory state in ways that we previously thought impossible to do. And lobbed missiles at Syria that made the red line very red indeed again. And, most important of all, break the sequester that was killing the Department of Defense. That omnibus bill that many of you object to, I know, had within it the one thing that was necessary for the country to survive, which was $700 billion in readiness funding that allows the Pentagon to go forward. It is not a perfect bill. It was an imperfect bill. And he hesitated at signing it, but as he said in his signing statement, he needs the Defense Department to be funded again. Under the sequester, it was dying. So he chooses his endpoint. And he got out of the Paris Accord, by the way, which I'm 100% in favor of, because it was basically, America, send money everywhere, and at the end of time, we'll not do anything. That's what the Paris Accord ended up to. And the Joint Control Accord was, let me give you $200 billion, and then you go ahead and proliferate with weaponry that we can't go on your military bases to inspect. It's a terrible deal. So he's getting to his end results. He's doing it by these two processes, which are parallel but dependent on each other. One is the staffing process that exists in argument in the Oval Office between very well-prepared people like Mike Pompeo. Why was former Congressman, now CIA Director, soon-to-be Secretary of State Pompeo elevated to be Secretary of State? Because he never, ever leaked. And he always gave his honest opinion, and he is a hawk. He is a very strong, a very clear-thinking individual when it comes to how the world is set up, and he has had briefing after briefing with the president. Probably no cabinet member has spent as much time with the president as Mike Pompeo has from the beginning, and the president took someone he trusted to present the cases he sought and to shut up after the decision is made if he doesn't like it, and not to fight a rearguard action which has been crippling some of the West Wing. Who has replaced H.R. McMaster, by the way, is a genius. His national security strategy, which was produced in December, will guide the administration forward. But when it came time to make a change, who did he select to make a change? John Bolton. John Bolton is as anti-Putin as anybody in the United States of America. He's a true freedom-loving, old-style Reagan conservative, full stop. Not a neocon, a conservative, a peace-through-strength conservative. He's bringing in his people, and the president selected him to come in, not to be shy, but to have these arguments. Who is in there all the time? Secretary Mattis is in there all the time. Larry Kudlow is not shy in retiring. He has surrounded himself with extraordinary, and John Kelly, Marine Corps General, Chief of Staff. This is a team not of rivals, but of leaders who are willing to argue points of view strenuously, but I believe about each of those 5 that I've just named, none of them will refuse to execute the decision or leak in an attempt to destroy its momentum. That is, to me, the decision-making process. And when you begin to take and drain your animus or your applause out of it, just make it an academic exercise. Is it yielding results? Yes, I wrote a long piece about it. Probably more significant first year of the presidency than any other than George W. Bush, which was significant for the attack, not for what the achievement was. Right? So it is the most significant, far more significant than Obamacare, which, by the way, has been repealed in effect as part of the mandate in the tax cut. It's dead Obamacare walking. It just doesn't know it yet. It's going to bleed out because of the insurance pools. So 2 processes. One, which is fed by tweets, by off-the-cuff remarks to the press, by chants at rallies, by an emotional and intuitive process that the director is creatively working through in public and very unnerving, and the second through a process which is very deliberate with very smart people. I close with the last most important thing for a law school audience. Nothing has been more purposeful in the first year of the presidency than his selection of Neil Gorsuch and 14 courts of appeal judges. And I would defy any conservative originalist, including the late, great Antonin Scalia, to have made 14 appointments as solid as these 14. If you add up the number of decisions those 14 appeals court judges will issue, given their average age of 42, over the course of a judicial career that will extend into their 30s, it is a monumental change in the course of the American judicial history. Moreover, if, as expected, Anthony Kennedy retires in June, and that is expected, not a big secret, and a second appointment is made, a conservative center-right, actual originalism dominant court will be in place. And the president will have delivered on his promise to select from that list. Do you notice that he changed the list to add one name, Brett Kavanaugh? One name. Why would you change a list to add one name? I suggest you start to study up on Brett Kavanaugh. That's what I think. But Justice Willett became Judge Willett here in the Fifth Circuit, or down the Fifth Circuit. The only place we have trouble is really the Ninth Circuit because of California is a problem, but they are extraordinary appointments. So for a rule of law conservative who is concerned most with national security, I'm as happy as can be because he got rid of the sequester and he delivered on the judges by the most unorthodox means I've ever seen, in a way that has been deeply upsetting to people who usually like it calm, cool, and collected, like George W. Bush and President Obama. I don't know if we can keep up this pace. I really don't. And in my book review that comes out, season 1 is over, season 2 is beginning. I don't think this is a 5-season show. It might be, because the pace is just exhausting. No book about the Trump presidency is actually accurate. Everything has changed in the book I just reviewed. Ron Kessler turned in his manuscript in January, and it's out of date. Irrelevant. All of the actors have changed. They're all gone. All the great quotes, they don't matter. Steve Bannon thought what? Who cares? He's gone. He's in exile. So it's going to be one season after another, and I don't know that we can do 4 or 5 of it. But please don't or as President Bush said, underestimate President Trump. There is a great deal of method to this presidency, and it has been significant beyond what any of us expected, and I think will continue to be because of the arrival of last year's speaker, not the coming of this year's. Thank you for having me. Questions? Here's the microphone right here.
If the United States pulls out of the Iran agreement, what happens with the other 4 or 5 countries that signed on our side?
Well, they will be faced with a choice as to whether or not to continue to do business with the Islamic Republic of Iran or to be on good terms with us. We still have enough economic power that our sanctions will take a bite out of Iran regardless of whether or not they follow. I don't expect the Germans to stop doing business tomorrow, but there will come pressure points along the way where they will be obliged to choose. And we can't get there unless we lead. And nobody thought that we would move the embassy to Jerusalem without incident and with indeed increasing American UN support, and that's what's happened. So he is willing to take the risk that we can lead, as Ronald Reagan said. People forget this, but I was there at the time. He deployed the Pershing II and the cruise missiles into Europe and Bill's nodding, because were you active duty then? Yeah. Did you really, on the cruise missile? The most important decision was one that no one remembers, is that he went through against the opposition of the nuclear freeze movement, and the allies in Europe waffled. And he said, no, they've moved the SS-20s to the front of the line, we're sending the cruise missile and the Pershings, and that was the beginning of the end. SDI also came into it. So he knows his own mind, and I think that it doesn't matter if they come along right away. What matters is what they do in 6 years. Illustration, Reykjavik was a great failure. You remember? 1986, I've been by the House, the famous photo of Reagan and Gorbachev leading. Gorbachev had spent 3 days setting the president up for the ask. 3 days of offering to cut this and give that and do away with this. And on the 4th day, he asked for SDI, and the president said no. And Gorbachev said, I've got to have it. And the president said, well, we're done here. And they left, and out came that famous photograph, and the Soviet Union dissolved in 3 years. Everyone thought it was a failure. It was, in fact, the greatest success of the Reagan presidency. There's one over here. Watching my clock.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I found myself nodding quite a bit, and in particular when you were discussing the lack of grace that this president has been given by the media, many of whom seem to think their job is to convince the American people that they made the wrong decision.
Well
but, and here's the but, this anxiety that you spoke about, this sort of head snapping that we have all experienced, how do you think it affects, you didn't really speak about its effect inside of foreign relations, and I'd be interested in your comments on that.
It's an interesting problem. It's not just the American people getting used to it, it's our allies. And I think Netanyahu is comfortable with it because Israeli politics, apparently our politics are like beanbag compared to Israeli politics. And in totalitarian countries, they get shot. By the way, I recommend all of you go see the movie The Death of Stalin, which is one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. Steve Buscemi playing Khrushchev in the aftermath of the death of Stalin and what goes on in a totalitarian regime. But I think we've unnerved Great Britain quite a lot. I think Liam Fox is very worried about international trade agreements. But they are learning, as I am learning, as anyone who's objective is learning, there is method here. And as the Chinese learned, he, like most developers, he asked for 1,000 units, and he's ready to settle for 400. But getting to the 400 is a long and it's a difficult process. So he opened bid on China on Friday, and the market dropped 400 points, and over the weekend it's leaked that we're not going to do this. And the market goes up 600 points. So everybody's kind of adjusting to the new major player in town, and it's very, very stressful, unless you're a Mike Pompeo or a John Bolton, and you can learn. About the media, I have to do one thing in defense of my colleagues at all of the networks. It's a money-driven business. You have to do what the ratings reward. Because we've divided the country into 2 tribes, there are sets of media for Tribe A and sets of media for Tribe B, and they go there to be reaffirmed in their conviction. And therefore, you want to, it's an endless loop of exaggerating criticism or exaggerating praise. It's a very perverse dynamic. It's not good for the country. But they're not doing it because they're so much out of conviction as that which gets rewarded gets repeated, and the ratings are off the charts for every cable news network and down for every network news. The difference being point of view is injected into the former and not into the latter. So there's an economic issue at work here. Time for one more, I think.
Over here. You discussed economics earlier and kind of the chaos in the Trump White House. We had the firing of Cohn, or the resignation of Cohn, and tariffs, and then the hiring of Kudlow, who is generally a free marketeer and anti-tariffs. You also mentioned the lack of chaos in the Trump White House. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit to that issue, the kind of organization of thought behind Trump and the issuing of tariffs, yet the hiring people who generally don't support tariffs.
I've had a lot of analogies to this, and pictures at an exhibition, or as orchestrated by Ravel, is one of them. There are a lot of different pictures, but there's some connective tissue. Or you can use a football game, or you can use a hockey with the second line. Gary Cohn did his job, which was to get the tax bill passed. Peter Navarro did his job, which was to persuade the president of some incredibly bad economic policies. Really bad economic policies. The market reacted poorly, and the president course-corrected and is bringing in a new line. And that new line is Larry Kudlow, who is a free marketeer. And he will hear that out, and he will decide on a case-by-case basis going forward. But what I began, and what I want to make sure I understand, I don't think it's chaotic. I don't. I think it's very deliberate, and he's very comfortable with it. And if you have a comfortable president who is confident in his own decision-making, just the head-snapping stuff is what we're not comfortable with. But it's working. We haven't had 4% economic growth. I don't know that we'll get there this year. I think we will. We haven't had that since Reagan. We didn't have 3% economic growth in 1 year of President Obama. We're going to have it for sure this year. And it's because it's working. It's just one hell of a bumpy ride. On that note, thank you very much.
Well, please join me in thanking Hugh Hewitt once again. Thank you.